This lecture will cover the different kinds of argument structures that we will arguments. The first type we'll look at is called a convergent argument. Here we have a number of different premises that don't work together to support the argument. Instead, they each provide separate support for the conclusion. So, in order to analyze an argument like this, we will need to examine the link from each premise to the conclusion and to see if it works. The next type of argument is called a linked argument. Here, the premises work together. So there could be one, two, there could be more premises. They work together to support the conclusion. Each premise on its own would not be just sufficient to support the conclusion. Then we have what is called a chain argument, which involves a chain of inferences. So premise 1 supports the subconclusion, and then the subconclusion supports the conclusion. Then finally, we can put it all together to make a complex argument. And once arguments get more complex, we will have structures like this. So overall, sort of at the top level, this is a convergent argument. We have two separate lines of argument, each supporting the conclusion. One side of the support is two linked premises, whereas on the other side, we have a premise leading to a subconclusion, which leads to the conclusion. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is we want to not confuse linked arguments and chain arguments. Consider, if I study hard for the first exam, then I'll get an A on the exam. If I get an A on the first exam, then I'll get an A on all of the rest of the exams. If I get an A on all the exams, then I'll get an A in the course. This is an example of a linked argument. So you couldn't go straight from, here's the conclusion. Therefore, if I study hard for the first exam, then I'll get an A in the course. So you couldn't go just from each of these premises to the conclusion. No, you need all of them together. And that is the most common type of argument, is a linked argument. This kind, the chain argument, is very rare. It's very easy to think of this as sort of a chain of inferences because each premise seems to lead to the next. So here the consequent of this statement is the antecedent of the next one, and so on. This is what's called a hypothetical syllogism. We will learn about that in a few days. So they do chain in sort of a way, but not in the way that's meant by this. Here, you have to be able to say, from premise 1, I can infer the subconclusion, just on its own. So if premise 1 is true, then the subconclusion is also true. But that's not how these work. It is not the case that if statement 1 is true, then statement 2 is true. However, it is the case that if statement 1, 2, and 3 are all true, then the conclusion must also be true as well.